An important specialization within archaeology is what we call bioarchaeology, which is the interdisciplinary and problem-oriented study of human remains from archaeological contexts. Now, what I mean by interdisciplinary is that this field of study draws on a number of other disciplines to answer several different questions about the past, and we'll talk about each of these that are listed here. And when we say problem-oriented, we mean that it's a specific focus on learning about individuals and their identities, because if we learn more about how people identified in the past, we can learn more about their societies within which they lived. Now, when we talk about the study of human remains, there is an important emphasis we need to make here in the Americas, because now we're dealing with descendant communities, people who have known ancestors that are still living. And it's important to recognize and respect the rights of those individuals and how they view how their ancestors' remains should be handled. Bioarchaeology provides us with an enormous amount of information about a deceased individual and their society that can be learned from studying the human skeleton. Things such as their age and sex, any disease or trauma that they experienced in their life, and their diet, which comes from studying the chemical composition of their bones and if they had any cavities. We'll get into this in a little bit. So the first sort of question that bioarchaeology helps us to get at is something called Paleo Demography. And this is when bioarchaeologists use biological information from graves and cemeteries to describe the major characteristics of a population. So, for example, they are able to recognize the age of different individuals based on certain measurements they can take on different parts of the body. So here we're seeing a part of the hip bone structure, and you can see the changing angle over time is depicting age differences. The same with the dentition patterns of different individuals. We know we grow more teeth over time, and those patterns help us to determine the age of an individual. The sex of an individual can also be determined from their body. The size and shape of the hip bones themselves can tell if it's a male or a female body. Also, there are certain characteristics on the skull that indicate more feminine or masculine traits. We're also able then, when it comes to paleodemography, look at and determine mortality and fertility rates. So these are measurements of the numbers of deaths and births in a particular population. That can help us to see, which segments of a population might be missing. So if we're seeing that there aren't many people past the age of 40, well, that helps us to determine what the maximum population of that population might have been. Paleodemography also helps us look at migration and the geographical extent of different groups and cultures across time and space. We can also determine population density based on, the numbers of individuals we find within cemeteries associated with sites. That can get us at the sort of density maps that we've talked about in the past. When it comes to mortuary analysis, this is the study of the material evidence surrounding death and burial. We tend to characterize mortuary contexts, and we also study them, though, within their larger context surrounding how death and burial are handled in different cultures. So the image you're seeing here on the right is an extended burial that was found within a Hohokam site. However, we know that Hohokam individuals did not practice extended burials, so it's been interpreted then that this particular burial is actually part of the Salado phenomenon that occurred during the Hohokam Classic period between 1250 and 1500 CE. Other sort of questions that we can address when it comes to mortuary analysis, is how do people think about the dead? How do they interact with the dead? What sort of funerary practices did they use? And was there any social inequality in the past? So if we see a very young person buried with lots of grave goods, that's a bit suspicious, because it might be in that case that they were part of an elite class who just inherently were born to have more status and importance than other individuals in that society because of the hereditariness of social inequality. the site where I work, La Quemada in Zacatecas, Mexico, we have documented a variety of burial practices and also the display of human remains in different parts of the site. This includes not only zompantlies or skull racks, which you might be familiar with, but hanging bundles of what we think might be ancestor remains rather than necessarily war captives who would have been sacrificed in other Mesoamerican cultures. So it's quite an interesting case study. Paleo Pathology, this is the study of medical disorders and injuries in the past. So someone's health status can be inferred from the condition of their bones and any trauma that might have affected their skeleton. You can see a healed bone. Well, that suggests that they were part of a community that was willing to take care of them until they were back on their feet again. You can also observe nutritional problems that might be reflected in different bones or bone growth patterns. Your teeth can also show patterns of nutritional stress at different times. There's only a small percentage, though, where we can actually see the cause of death. That's because not all causes of death are shown on the bones themselves. Types of questions that a paleopathologist might be interested in determining are what kinds of diseases affected past populations, how did a disease spread, and were the sick actually cared for, or overall just how healthy were past populations. This field allows us to look at different traces, as I said, on the skeleton themselves. So stress during an individual's lifetime might be revealed within their skeleton. Malnourishment can cause the disruption of bone growth. Tooth enamel reflects any kind of childhood malnutrition, as an irregular series of lines on the teeth, and you can see that in the bottom right photo here. Arthritis results in accumulated bone tissue that around the affected areas, so any kind of joint areas that would have experienced that, we can see that. Also, various infectious diseases may result in bone loss or pitting. Also, the deformation of the skull itself or other bone surfaces. So you can see syphilis down here affecting the skull of this individual. An important factor within mortuary analysis and bioarchaeology is what we call the osteological paradox. And so this comes down to questions of health, and you need to be careful when you are drawing any conclusions about it, because different diseases may cause identical reactions, making them indistinguishable, and also some diseases might not actually affect the skeleton. So, for example, let's consider 3 subpopulations within a community that are exposed to a disease that risks death and causes skeletal lesions. In the first population, none of the individuals are affected by the disease. In the second population, individuals experience the disease, are sick for a while, and characteristic bony lesions are observed on these individuals, but they survive. In the third population, everyone experiences the disease and are killed before bone lesions are manifested. In the archaeological record, the population that never experiences the disease and the population that is killed by the disease before skeletal stress indicators can be observed and will look exactly the same. So, who is healthier within that population? We wouldn't be able to tell the difference then by people who just were never exposed to the disease or those who succumb to it immediately. So this is why we have specialists that know how to consider these issues. Violence and trauma is something that can also be observed and recorded among past societies. We want to know about how violent a past society was. Perhaps we can reconstruct a sequence of events that would have led to a traumatic or life-ending injury. It's also very interesting when we can find cases where traumatic injuries were actually treated in the past. Excuse me. And of course, any kind of changes in the rates of personal violence over time would be an interesting factor depending on the questions you are interested in researching. Biological affinity, this is the study of how peoples, either individuals or entire groups, were related to each other. And in the past, this was done most commonly through the study of craniometrics, so different measurements on the skull itself. And the closer a population is in terms of the traits that they share, we can observe that. Nowadays, we also have nuclear DNA and mDNA, which helps us to determine exactly how closely related populations were. Isotopic analysis is also something that is really revolutionizing the field. This affects people and animals, and we talked about a little bit about isotopic measurements when we talked about radiocarbon dating in the past. So there are elements out in the atmosphere, specifically carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and strontium, that are absorbed into organic materials, and this includes us. Now, these isotopic ratios can be extracted from our bones after we've died in order to assess any dietary patterns we engaged in, any migration patterns. So if we grew up in one place that had a different isotopic signature from the place we're buried, bioarchaeologists are actually able to identify that. This also, of course, helps with paleoclimatic reconstructions and determining the effect of environmental change on organisms. The questions you might be interested in addressing as a bioarchaeologist with isotopic analysis specialization is, how did diet vary with social status? So do we see a difference in the population among those who could consume more meat, or maybe were dependent more on maize? Those are differences we would be able to pick up. And of course, just the mobility of past populations. The samples themselves then can be taken from bone, skin, hair, teeth, plants, any kind of organic material. And it's important to establish the local baselines for where you're working. So often this involves collecting water, plants, and soil from the area of your study. And then you are able to know what the local signature is and determine if anyone has a different signature and therefore might have come from somewhere else. Lastly, there is forensic anthropology, and that is the application of bioarchaeological methods within a legal setting. So if there's a body that's being recovered, we find remains. These are forensic anthropologists who go in to potentially identify the victim, reconstruct the circumstances of their death, and who actually give legal testimony for what they were able to interpret. So I have included some additional videos to help provide you with greater information and context on bioarchaeology, so I encourage you to watch those next. Because your homework assignment involves looking at information on the burials that were found underneath the Feathered Serpent Pyramid, at the site of Teotihuacan in central Mexico. There are a series of burials that were found along 3 sides and along the north-south axis underneath the pyramid itself. So I've given you maps that show the distribution of bodies by age, by sex within the burials, what sort of grave goods they were buried with, and you then, for your homework assignment, need to draw on your knowledge of bioarchaeology to investigate any kind of patterns that you're able to observe within these burials. So take a look at those plans and be as descriptive as possible in your answers in the quiz.